I'm Matt Holland, the Programs and Volunteer Coordinator at the Buffalo History Museum, and we've got a really special program for you tonight. I just want to get some ground rules and general information out there while we're going. So we will be recording this event and you can see it afterwards. I'll send a link to everybody who's registered. So if you know somebody who can't make it tonight or couldn't you just get the tech going for them, we'll definitely have it available later on. So don't worry about that. I'll send a link to anybody who's registered. And the other thing is we'll have a Q&A at the end. Just make sure that you use the Q&A option that's available to you down on the bottom menu there. That's a little bit easier for us to use than the chat menu. So if you have any questions along the way, we might try to answer things along the way, but it's usually easier just to answer everything at the end. And the other thing is just to get this out there, our membership supports these webinars, and I'll put a link in the chat menu there if you're interested. But we would thank all of our members for support. Thank you for joining us. But anyways, we have a really special program tonight. We have our good friend Tim Wendel here. You might remember him from the Braves program that we did a while back, which was a lot of fun. He's a Lockport native, and he's the author of 14 books, novels, and narrative fiction. He wrote Buffalo, Home of the Braves, Summer of '68, Escape from Castro's Cuba, and Cancer Crossings, which is the book that we're going to be discussing tonight. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Tim with that.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you all for coming in, and a big thank you to the Buffalo History Museum for sponsoring tonight's event. These days we hear a lot about the promise or the potential of a cancer moonshot, and we appear to be on the cusp of one, thanks to immunotherapy, other advances that are going on out there. But I think what's too often forgotten is we had a moonshot. It was nearly 60 years ago, and so much of it centered here in Western New York at Roswell Park Cancer Center, and also then soon after at St. Jude. And so I'm delighted this evening to welcome Mary Pinkle and Dr. Jerome Yates. Mary is the fourth of Dr. Donald Pinkle's 10 children. Mary is currently working on a book about her father's role at the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, where he was the founding director, serving from 1961 to 1973. Also, this book is going to focus on their family's experience moving south from Buffalo. No, don't go, stay in Buffalo during the civil rights era. Dr. Jerry Yates has directed many pioneering clinical trials at Roswell Park. He also researched how to prevent infections in patients undergoing high-dose chemotherapy and bone marrow transplants. Presently, he's a clinical professor and teaches part-time at the School of Public Health and Health Sciences, SUNY at Buffalo. So thank you both for joining us tonight. I think on what's a very special evening as we kind of look back, I think again, it's something that's been overlooked and forgotten. Jerry, I'd like to start with you. Chemotherapy, which at times here, I'm gonna get in the weeds here with some science, and both of you guys, please correct me when I go off the tracks. But chemotherapy is using several cancer-fighting drugs at once, in a sense, against the cancer. It's pretty much a regular procedure now. A half century ago, this was considered radical, and in fact had a lot of opposition and such. Just get people up to speed. Jerry, how did we go from A to Z, and a little bit what was Buffalo and Roswell Park's role in that?
Well, I think that one of the first stimuli for developing anti-cancer chemotherapy was the fact that a ship sunk during the Second World War in the Mediterranean and released a bunch of nitrogen mustard in the water, and the sailors that were in the water ended up getting bone marrow aplasia. And so there was a clue that this affected rapidly dividing cells. Then in 1947, Sidney Farber, who graduated from the University of Buffalo, was the head of pathology, actually the first pediatric pathology specialist in the country. He was at in Boston on the Harvard faculty, and he noted that folic acid would stimulate the uh, proliferation of leukemic cells. And so one of the things he did in 1947 was to take a folic acid antagonist called amethopterin and use this to treat some young children with acute lymphocytic leukemia. And he was able to put them into remission. And he did this in an environment where there were a couple of people in Boston at the time by doctors Damashek and Crosby, who wanted to follow the dictum, do no harm. And that's what physicians are supposed to do. Well, there's got to be a balance between looking ahead and trying something new and not harming the patients. And they were very adversarial. And when I started my career in this business in the 60s, you know, some of my friendly colleagues would call me a poison pusher.
Right.
So
And-
that's how that started there. And actually, Mary's probably going to say something about this, but her dad was working with Sidney Farber for a period of time.
Right. Go ahead, Mary, because that's where your father kind of comes into the equation. And Jerry, thanks. Before Mary jumps in, I think what people need to keep in mind is it's not everybody around the campfire kumbaya. We're going to get to a little bit of the hostile environments here. There was real push back and forth. But Mary, pick up the story there. Your dad's in Boston. He's a Buffalo guy. And so how's all that work?
So what happened was my dad grew up in Buffalo, went to medical school in Buffalo, and decided really in his second year of medical school that he wanted to go into pediatric leukemia. He was doing a hematology elective and saw his first patient with leukemia and was appalled that when they approached the patient and the patient's mother, the doctor said, well, let's just move on. The best we can do for him is to send him home to die. And my dad was just floored and said, well, can't we do something? And he actually read Sidney Farber's article. It was in, I think, the New England Journal in 1948, the year before. And so being my dad, he, you know, was reading all these journals, first year of medical school. And so he said, what about that drug that Sidney Farber discovered in Boston? It's, you know, I think it's called methotrexate, and it has another name, but that's the one I can remember. So we said, well, what about that? And the attending said, well, that's too toxic. But the attending said, hey, why don't you go do some experiments? So he went and did some experiments and they didn't work out. But he felt so devastated by the fact that at that time, pediatric leukemia was the leading cause of death for children they were seeing in Buffalo and in the country. And it still is a leading cause of death. And the medical profession was just abandoning these children and their families. And I think he thought, I've got to work on this. This is a big problem. So anyway, he decided that that's what he would do. And he did a residency in Buffalo. And I have to say, he always told us how he got the best medical education at the University of Buffalo, because he said he got to know patients and families and connected with them. And that was encouraged at Buffalo. And they also encouraged his interest in cancer. And as a young resident, he started his own cancer service because there wasn't really anything there. Nobody was doing anything, but they encouraged him. And he was supposed to do a fellowship at Sloan Kettering and got drafted. He was a reservist in the Korean War and ended up on an army base in Massachusetts and got polio. And anyway, as part of his recovery, he ended up with Sidney Farber. Through some Buffalo connections, he ended up being a fellow at the Jimmy Fund Cancer Institute, which is one of the most exciting places he said he'd ever worked, because at that point, that was the mecca for pediatric cancer in the world. So anyway, he was with Sidney Farber for probably a year and a half as a fellow, and Farber was very kind to him. Said, I want you to work part-time. You half time you're doing your rehab because you're just getting back on your feet. My dad had actually, my sister Becky was just reminding me that the other day, because I wasn't born yet, but he was in a wheelchair. I mean, he was in bed for months and then in a wheelchair and then just getting these crutches and canes going. And so anyway, Farber was very kind and said, I want you to rehab half the day. So we went to the VA hospital. And then the other half of the day, he started working on this very sophisticated cancer research with Farber at the Jimmy Fund, which is part of Harvard Medical School.
Right.
So that's how we ended up being with Dr. Farber.
And then he comes to Buffalo and becomes pretty much the first director of pediatrics at Roswell Park. And this is where he was going to, in a sense, stay. I mean, the roots, I think we just need to emphasize a little bit. And I think a lot of people think of Dr. Donald Pinkle, somewhat maybe with Sidney Farber getting his start, but certainly St. Jude today. And we're going to get into that, his founding of that, but how deep his roots are here in Western New York.
That's correct. And and I have to say, I feel honored that I can be here to talk about my dad, because he would love this, because he was always really proud of his Buffalo roots and all the things that all the privileges he got growing up there, even though his family had no money. But he's not in the health, he's not in a position health-wise to be here. So I feel really honored to be here speaking for him. But his Buffalo roots definitely called him back to Buffalo. I think they gave him $9,000. And at that point, I had just been born. So he had 4 children to support on $9,000. But because he'd been disabled and had basically, the Army told him, you're disabled, you need to get out. So he had a little Army pension, and he was always able to support the family with that Army pension. And then these jobs he had when I was growing up that never paid very much money. So that was kind of an important thing. So the family was very glad to get back to Buffalo, because we had all these children and we had wonderful relatives to help out around the house with all these kids running around.
And we're gonna go a little bit deeper Buffalo and then the move to Memphis here in just a bit. But Jerry, we got to bring in another major principal character here. And in fact, I think we've got a photo of him with Dr. Pinkle, but this is Dr. James Holland, who in a sense you worked very, very closely with. We're going to bring up a photo, I think, here in a little bit of Dr. Pinkle and Dr. Holland together, but give us, in a sense, the background on Dr. Holland, Jerry. They lived in North Buffalo, and what was he like to work with, and what was he like to, whoops, wrong photo. But in a sense, how was he as a leader, and also how was he in terms of, there we go. There they are coming off a plane. I believe this is 1958, 59, something like that. And that's Dr. Pinkle on the right, and Dr. Holland kind of in the center with the 2 bags. So anyway, Jerry, go ahead. Tell us about, if we're going to do Dr. Pinkle, we got to know Dr. James Holland. So please give us the background on him.
Well, Jim, I guess some people would describe as enthusiastic, sometimes bombastic, and perhaps the extrovert of the duo, but he came to Roswell in 1974 from the National Cancer Institute. He had developed a protocol for treating childhood leukemia consisting of combination therapy, 6-mercaptopurine and methotrexate. He brought that protocol to Buffalo.
Right, in 1954, right? Came in 54.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry, 1954. So Dr. Pinkle didn't come until 1956, but they were both on a mission to do something about acute leukemia. One of the things that occurred with the kids was that they could be put into remission. The blood would look normal after some treatments, but then they would relapse after weeks or a few months. And one of the problems was the children had sanctuary sites, either in the gonads or in the brain. And one of the things that Dr. Pinkel brought to the table was the idea that you really had to treat the whole patient in terms of dealing with some of these sanctuary sites. And he actually was participating in the acute leukemia group B while he was at Roswell, and he and Jim were basically colleagues, and with a mission. And when he proposed some approaches like intrathecal drugs or like radiation for the CNS leukemia as part of the total treatment, the conservatives in the ALGB and the leukemia committee thought that it was too aggressive, that he was being too tough. So even among enthusiastic hematologists about treating and curing or attempting to cure acute leukemia, they were somewhat reluctant. To give you a feel about Jim's personality, when he was a medical student at Columbia, and Edith Spruill, who was a pathologist at Roswell, used to tell this story. And one of the things that Jim loved to do was if you were giving a presentation and you had numbers that were in rows and columns, he would quickly add all these up to make sure there weren't any mistakes. One of his teachers at Columbia was a Dr. Loeb, who was the co-author of the first major medical textbook in the United States, Cecil and Loeb. And during one of his lectures, he put up a slide. Jim interrupted him and told him that his numbers didn't add up. And so Loeb was a little pompous, and so Edith Spruill told the story about there were a few faculty members there that they couldn't believe that anybody would have the audacity to interrupt him and tell him that his numbers didn't add up. But Jim did, and there was a little bit of concern that maybe he might hold it against him in the future. So through all the years that I knew him and going to meetings with him, he never lost his interest in adding up the columns and the rows to make sure people weren't sloppy and didn't edit their scientific material. He was very good at that. He was also a very good teacher. And much the same as Don Pinkle saw something that Farber had written, I did too when I was an intern. And he said he was on a mission to cure acute leukemia, and I had a couple of patients who had cancer who were essentially abandoned by the system, and I read that and I thought, well, that makes sense, and ultimately I ended up coming to Buffalo the first time to train with Jim.
Mm-hmm. And here's a photo of both of you guys together. I'm guessing this is probably late 60s or something like that. And I can feel, I know Loeb's pain a little bit because I was on and doing my book, Cancer Crossings, a little bit on the receiving end, so to speak, when my figures didn't add up necessarily sometimes with Dr. Holland. We had this interesting time where, you know, we met in person, but frankly, the way it worked out the best for our conversations was on the phone. And at that point, he was working at Mount Sinai, and I'll still never forget, he said something like, you know, pretty much finish up about 4:15, 4:20 every day, here to 4:45, 5 at the max. That's the time to catch me. See you later. And that was, in a sense, you know, how brisk it was. And you knew, you know, it was like you were on stage a little bit, and, you know, any question that wasn't kind of well rehearsed out or thought out, he was going to take it in a different direction. Mary, we've got your dad in Buffalo, but it's not meant to be. He's going to move to Western Tennessee. He's going to take the family with him. You're going to leave Woodward Avenue, wave it goodbye, and talk a little bit about, and you know, you're also living for a while over in Fort Erie. Talk a little bit about the memories in Buffalo, but also, in a sense, the start of this move and both how maybe it impacted your father, in a sense, going to found St. Jude, but also how it impacted you and the family.
Well, we had, and my older sisters are even more, convinced of this. We had a great thing going on Woodward Avenue in Buffalo. Great family next door that eventually had 13 children. I think I had 2 kids to play with that were my age. There were just lots of kids. We were close to Delaware Park. We had lots of cousins, wonderful aunts and uncles. We had, grandparents, great cousins. We had this wonderful Uncle Don Jacoby, who was always organizing, baseball games and Red Rover. And our dad couldn't do these things because of his physical disability, but Uncle Don sure could. And we were always doing fun things like having picnics on the beach over in Canada. So we had a really nice family life. And we moved over to near Lake Erie in is a Windmill Point Road in 1959. And I was just a 3-year-old, but we were just basically outside all day and playing. And my sisters went to a 2-room schoolhouse in Ridgeway, Ontario, or Ridgeway, Crystal Beach area. And I went there for kindergarten for about a month. So it was a really fun time. And one thing I have to add, Roswell Park back then had these incredible scientists working there and coming through. And there was one scientist none of us will ever forget. Her name was Rita Levy Montalcini. And she showed up one night for dinner in a fur coat and heels, high heels. And she was this tiny, glamorous woman. And my dad had this funny little boat. It wasn't even a sailboat that he took down to the lake. And it was probably like September, October. So it was kind of cold out and the sand was kind of dirty and muddy. And this woman is in these fancy heels and gets into my dad's boat as if it's some fancy yacht, And they had this boat ride and then we had dinner and she was so enthusiastic. And I was probably 4 and I thought, wait a minute, what's this woman in high heels and a fur coat doing, being so happy about getting her beautiful heels messed up and getting into my dad's crummy boat. But she was this amazing person. And in 1986, I was up in Alaska and I read she won the Nobel Prize in medicine. So, but what an amazing experience as a child to meet Nobel Prize winners wearing fancy clothes. And then there was another really special person that would come over. His name was Mort Levin, and he had figured out in 1950 that cigarettes can cause cancer. And he'd been at Roswell Park between 1938 and 1950, and then he came back in the late 50s and was there with my dad, and he was a family friend. And his family, again, another foreign doctor, we got to know a lot of doctors from different countries growing up through St. Jude's and Roswell. But he'd come over from Russia with his family from Georgia. And so when he would come over on the Peace Bridge to come to our house, they would ask, well, where were you born? And so we kids were all, I'm born in Buffalo and I was born in Boston. But Dr. Levin would tell them, I was born in Georgia. And so you can imagine in 1959, there was saying you were born in Georgia, Russia wasn't going to go over too well. So we thought he was just the greatest guy, but also played a very important role in medicine and figuring out really early on the link between cigarettes and cancer. So anyway, those are just some fun memories I have.
There's your dad early on. I believe this is at Roswell Park. So when he was director of pediatrics. So that's a great photo. Jerry, we got to return to, any good story has conflict and opposition. And you guys certainly had a fair amount where we're back to hostile environment a little bit. I think with anything that's original or cutting edge, there's going to be some pushback. Tell us just a little bit about you guys are daring to take on, in a sense, childhood leukemia. What was some of the pushback from, in a sense, the more establishment or from some of your medical peers?
Well, Mary alluded to this a little bit, and actually it was not uncommon for physicians taking care of these kids to say, we'll give them some prednisone and send them home. And the patients were looking, the patient's parents were looking for hope. And and the availability of protocols was such that that gave them some hope, and so they were willing to enter their children into these protocols. Well, it also takes a scientific leaders like Jim Holland, but also like George Moore, who was the director of the institute at the time, who recruited both Jim and Dr. Pinkel. And he was a surgeon trained in Minnesota, but also was interested in research and recognized the importance of clinical research and supported the activities like the beginning of the acute leukemia group B, which was a consortium to treat a group of patients with acute lymphocytic leukemia on a multi-institutional protocol, set up the statistical office to handle this. And at the same time, a fellow by the name of Myron Harishishin and Jim set up the gynecologic oncology group at Roswell. About the same time, Marv Zellen came from the NCI, and he was important in terms of being the statistician for both the radiotherapy oncology group as well as the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group. ALGB dealt with hematologic malignancies, and ECOG was dealing with what we call solid tumors, like the common tumors, breast, whatever. Anyway, the picture you're looking at right now is the laminar airflow rooms where we were, and this was my major project in the late 60s, looking at whether or not protecting patients in rooms where you could filter all of the microbes except for viruses out of the air, sterilizing their food, giving them antibiotics to suppress the bacteria in their guts, whether we could give more chemotherapy or prepare them for bone marrow transplant, and whether or not the results would be better. This also was the area where Jimmy Holland got started. Jimmy was Jim's wife. Jimmy was a psychiatrist, and a few of us behind Jim's back used to say it was good that he was married to a psychiatrist. And the reality is that she provided a lot of balance to his enthusiasm. And she also had residents rotating through Roswell who were studying the patients, and they did a study of the patients in the isolators and found, just as many people have found today with the pandemic, that one of the things that caused the most consternation for both the families and the patients was the inability to touch each other's skin. And that was a major problem. And that was one of the areas where she got started, and she really is the founder of psychosocial oncology. She then extended some of her work to the cancer and acute leukemia group B, where she looked at various stress factors that were not being considered. Most of the people involved in the chemotherapy studies early on were physicians, but they were also had a pharmacologic bent and had sort of a surgical mentality. And it was she provided a lot of balance to the enthusiasm, and I think provided comfort to the patients and the families in an era where this basically didn't exist.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I think you brought up a great point, Jerry, with what we've been going through the last year with COVID. Jimmy Holland was very much into, just the emotion of touch, how much, how important touch is, how important, company, being, within proximity of folks is so important. I enjoyed my conversations with her. I found her much less intimidating than Dr. Jim Holland, but that.
You aren't the only one.
I highly recommend some of her books. I mean, her books are still, very much, especially with what we've been dealing with the last year or so. Mary, let's make the final move where we're going from Buffalo to Memphis. So we're going to Western Tennessee. And, Jerry was just talking about, some of the things that are pushing back, hostile environments, things that, are making, in a sense, plans kind of difficult. Tell us a little bit about what your father didn't realize and what he faced when he landed in Memphis, bringing along you and the rest of the family, and what he had to overcome to kind of put St. Jude together, which we see ads for all the time. Or I think some people just kind of put St. Jude out there now on some kind of pedestal. I mean, he's the guy that brought it up to there. So what did he face? Walk us through some of that.
So it's interesting. First of all, he took the job. He was really going to take a job in Denver at the Colorado Medical School, and it was going to offer a lot of money and beautiful setup. But he got invited to interview at St. Jude's on his way down to Denver, and thought, well, okay, I'll just stop there, because he was actually really interested in civil rights and thought, well, this is the middle of the South. This is where these freedom riders are coming through nearby in Mississippi and Alabama. So he thought, well, I'll just stop by and see what this is about. And so anyway, he went down there and interviewed, and what he felt was that this was an area of the country that really needed a good hospital for children, for pediatric leukemia and all sorts of other diseases. And so we saw a real need there. So he took the job, and we all ended up going down there, and he got down and realized that they hadn't raised enough money, and the hospital was still under construction. We went down in October of '61, and we'd probably been in town for maybe a few weeks, and we all went down to look at the hospital. I was only in kindergarten, but I thought, oh my God, it was just, like a construction site. It looked nothing like Roswell Park, where I'd just been in the parking lot, but I knew it was then called Buffalo Children's. My mom had the two babies that were born in Buffalo there when I was, younger, and this was not a hospital. I thought, well, what's going on here? And so anyway, they hadn't raised enough money, and it was incredibly stressful. And he said, once we got down there, we'd moved all the furniture in. He said, I don't know what, I made a huge mistake. He just didn't know what to do. And fortunately, the chairman of the board was this man named Mr. Barry, who was very well connected, had a lot of influence, and he was apparently paying bills for the hospital on basically a line of credit from the bank. He had these pledges that they'd gotten people to pledge money, but they didn't have the money yet. So he was like taking out these loans from this bank. And I think at some point even paying my dad's salary from his own money. And he was from a wealthy family himself, but nevertheless, so it was really a shoestring operation. And fortunately, because of his ties to Roswell Park and his involvement with the National Institute of Health and the National Cancer Institute, he was able to bring in huge grants to St. Jude's. And so it was really, when I talked to my dad, he said at the beginning of St. Jude's, it was all about the National Cancer Institute. And we kids all remember, I think it was Kenny Endicott was his name. He was from the NCI. Dr. Zubrod came through. All sorts of people were always coming through, talking to my dad, and they were all always very supportive of what St. Jude's was doing. And so, now St. Jude's has a very successful charity, ALSAC, which was in existence at the time, but then was just getting started. But it was really through the federal government that he was able to get St. Jude's where it got to when he came up with his Total Therapy 5 study that was so successful. So that was a big problem initially. And then the other problem was the the segregation and the prejudice that he found when he started St. Jude's. For the first thing he did was he looked at the architecture plans, and St. Jude was designed by a friend of Danny Thomas's, who was a prominent Hollywood Black architect, but he had just done like the general design, probably on a napkin or something. And the local architects had to complete the design, and they had separate bathrooms for Blacks and whites. And this was supposed to be an integrated hospital. And St. Jude's, I think, was the first fully integrated hospital for children in the South. And my dad's looking at these bathroom plans, and he says, no, and he just told them right out, no, you're changing the plans. And fortunately, it was, he said it was a young architect, very, very happy to change the plans. So, but he got some flack for that. And then another thing was wages. Apparently at the time, you were supposed to, if you were an employer, you were supposed to pay your Black employees less than your white employees. And he said, I'll have none of that. And they got, some having equal wages. And he got flack for that. And somebody went to the board and complained that he was throwing away their money because he was paying the Black employees the same as the white employees. So there are a lot of challenges. And another big one was, and I didn't know about this till recently, they had to house some of the St. Jude families, because some of these families were coming in from, pecan farms in Arkansas and Louisiana. And so that was their practice. And I think Roswell Park did this too. They put them up in hotels, and the hotels wouldn't take the Black families. And my dad said, okay, if you're not taking, we're not sending you anybody if you don't take all of our patients. And then they said, I guess, well, okay, but they have to eat in their rooms. And my dad's like, no, I told you, if you want our people, you got to treat them equally. So that was a big thing. And I think he actually integrated some of the hotels in Memphis because of that. Because at that point in the early 60s, this was before the Civil Rights Act, there was pretty heavily segregated. So those were some big challenges right there.
Yeah, and I think, you talked about the role of National Cancer Institute and federal money and such, but and the conversations I've had with your dad and looking back on those days too, I've always been just enthralled by his problem solving ability. I mean, one of my favorite stories is, I guess, the blood banks in Memphis were prohibitively expensive, and somehow you were only supposed to use these local blood banks. And he told me when I was writing Cancer Crossings, he said, no, this isn't going to work. And he reached out, and I've forgotten the name, but there's an army base, some military base nearby. And he went, in a sense, to the commander, commandant of the base and just said, okay, you and we're going to work something out. And they worked out a thing where, in a sense, you would get a free weekend pass into town. Let's go to Beale Street, wherever it may be. Yeah. And if you gave blood, and within a year, as your father said, I broke those blood banks. In a sense, I had more, and they were coming to me. And he's, I love your dad because he's somewhat unassuming, but you can see the wheels turning, and you just go, all right, how am I going to do this? And it's going to be in some usually very original, interesting way. So, please wish him our best. I miss my conversations with him. He's the best. Jerry, I want to kind of do something here on a study that you were very pivotal with called 7 and 3 with Dr. Holland. And you're probably going to have to address some of the science in it. But the reason I bring it up is I think it would help folks to understand, in essence, what the adversary, for lack of a better word, that you guys were up against in cancer, and how kind of capricious and how almost like a shapeshifter it can be. 7 and 3, you were treating acute myeloid leukemia, and you guys pretty much determined it needed 7 days of a cancer fighting drug called cytarabine, and then was followed by 3 days of an antibiotic, anthracycline, I believe. And is this ratio, this 7 to 3 was the key. It became the standard for the next 40 years. In the cancer research world. And I've always been amazed by that because it had to be 7 and 3. It couldn't be like 10 and 2 or 5 and 4, or 5 and 5 or whatever it may be. And just take us through that study and how it came about and how you look at it now especially that kind of almost mysterious ratio of 7 and 3.
Well, it's not mysterious. It was a stepwise progression that evolved out of the cooperative group activities. And I just go back that these diseases are not as common as breast cancer or lung cancer or colon cancer. And so multi-institutions were involved in collecting data, and the oncologists were important, but so were the biostatisticians, and it was sort of a shotgun marriage with the cooperative groups, because here you have physicians that are used to being autonomous and treating individual patients and not always following the same rigorous approach. And then you have the biostatisticians say, well, we've got to have a protocol where we look at eligibility requirements so that we don't have selection bias. And we have to look at how we're going to collect the data and then how we're going to analyze the data. And the biostatisticians at the time, when Marv Zellen came to Buffalo from the NCI and started the ECOG and the RTOG statistical office, he told me one day, he came, he was hired at UB and hired in the Department of Mathematics. The theoretical mathematicians viewed him as being sort of a garbage collector, and for the physicians, for the cooperative groups. And I can tell you at that period of time when I left Roswell to go to the University of Vermont, and for a period I was the only oncologist in Vermont. There were conservative hematologists, but in the Department of Medicine there, I was the lowest man on the totem pole because the prejudice was, cardiology was great, gastroenterology was great. You have all these other specialties, but who would want to take care of a bunch of dying patients? Anyway, the cooperative groups afforded a marriage between rigor from the statistical side to an innovation from the medical side. And so the reason we went from, because I did a pilot study doing 5 and 2, 5 days of continuous infusion cytosine rhabdomycin and 2 days of daunorubicin, and we didn't take all of the bad cells out of the bone marrow. And so the next thing, so we looked at the data from the pilot study, and Jim said, and there was already a confirmatory study in CLGB where they essentially showed the same thing that we showed in the pilot study. So I said, well, let's increase the dose. And so rather than increase the dose for the individual days, we elected to stay with the same dose, but to give them 7 and 3 instead of 5 and 2. And unfortunately, that remained the standard of treatment for acute myelocytic leukemia for about 40 years. And it's still a standard induction treatment for acute myelocytic leukemia in most third world countries. So I'm happy to say that things are changing here, and when there's new drugs, there's new approaches, and all of these are generally tested by the, again, because of the relative rarity of the diseases, are tested by the cooperative groups. The other thing that the cooperative groups did, and I have a very close friend who was with me in Vermont, who used to tell me, because I was actively involved with the CLGB then, he said, well, the groups reach statistically significant answers to insignificant questions. And I used to say that's a bunch of crap, that they take stepwise approaches to do what they're doing. One of the problems that occurred in the 70s, both at MD Anderson and Memorial Sloan Kettering, and I'm sure that I'll probably get a few arrows from this one, but they were using historical controls. And one of the problems with using historical controls as a measure of whether or not you're getting improvement is that, in fact, you classify the disease better, you change the eligibility requirements for the patients, and the supportive care usually, whether it's blood products or antibiotics, have improved over time. And that's one reason why cancer centers do a better job than the communities, generally speaking, because they're more selective in the patients. They have a system that is set up to take care of the patients in a better manner. And so as they start a new protocol, the outcomes look better than the outcomes did for 4 or 5 years before. So, the 7-3 wasn't an accident, was a logical move to try to eradicate the leukemia. And we learned a lot along the way.
Great. Let's see, we've got a question from the audience, so I'm going to kind of go with this. Mary, why don't you start with this first from your dad's point of perspective, and then Jerry, you can chime in. The question is, what kind of personal impact did working with so many seriously ill children have on the doctors? It must have been very difficult at times. Go ahead, Mary.
Well, I think, it had a significant impact. My dad never liked Christmas. And so Christmas was always a challenge because unfortunately, they wanted to send children home, but children often came back much sicker because they may have gotten exposed to, other childhood diseases, even a common cold, or, unfortunately in your brother's case, the chicken pox. Tim, you talk about that in your book, but so children would often come back sicker from the holidays. And so as a result, my dad really didn't like Christmas. And it was hard because and it often would lose patients at Christmas. So that it always made that time of year really, really difficult. And he wouldn't talk about it, but he'd come home sometimes and be very quiet. And my mom would say he lost a patient, so we had to kind of be quiet and behave ourselves, which was very difficult because we were a very rowdy bunch. So, this poor guy's coming home. He's lost 3 patients. I think you might have mentioned this in your book. He lost 3 patients in one day at Roswell Park. So I was probably running around, jumping up and down on my toy horse. And, here's this guy who's just lost 3 patients. And so I think it has an impact, and it was really, really a rough go of things. But I have to say, in my house, my mom was, they later divorced, but my mom was just amazing. We had a Roswell Park party one time where the staff was coming over, their families, and she made a lollipop tree. And she was like, had me helping her hang lollipops from trees. And at that point, I knew that there was something really serious at Roswell Park. And I just thought, why are we hanging lollipops on trees for these people who are dealing with dying children? It just seemed very, very much of a contrast. But I think she really tried to make our home really cheerful and fun for our dad. But I think sometimes it was just, he would just come home and just want us to leave him alone because it had been such a really rough day, as you can imagine.
Oh, very much so. Jerry, you and I talked, I think, at one point how, and I brought this up later with Jim Holland, kind of continuing this thread, how so many of you pioneers in this field had like a patient or two that you never really forgot, and it kind of fueled you to go ahead. So talk to us again a little bit about, Mary's talking about Dr. Pinkle's, I guess, resiliency to move ahead. What kept you going, especially when the odds were really against you guys in the 60s? Well,
first of all, the patients are sick and they need somebody, and you can offer them hope, and you develop relationships with the patients. You try not to get really close to too many of the patients, but you inevitably do. And they're real people. You get to know their families, and as today in medicine, what what's happening is they're dividing up the body parts so that if you have diabetes, you go to an endocrinologist. If you have high blood pressure, you may go to a cardiologist. And the day of the family practitioner knowing that there's financial problems in the family are gone. But oncologists, cancer docs, get to know the patients and get to know the patient's family. And the patients appreciate what you're trying to do. They also try to protect you sometimes when they know things are not going to go well. It when you do have successes, it's just wonderful. And I'll just say, I couldn't be a pediatric oncologist because the kids, when I was the medical director at Roswell, going on the pediatric floor and seeing some of those kids was tough. But at the flip side of it is, I remember we were giving white blood cell transfusions. We were using an IBM centrifuge to collect white blood cells. And one little kid I saw looked like he was moribund, and they gave him a large enough dose of white blood cells. We weren't seeing good responses in adults, but this kid was laying in bed and looked like he was going to die. And after the white blood cell transfusion, I went back up there later on that day, and he was playing. And the kids bounce back they have amazing resilience when they're doing okay. And so, you know, they even know how to get in trouble when they bounce back. So you get your satisfaction out of the successes and out of the gratitude of the families and the patients. And the other benefit is that you actually hit, when I look back, when I started out, 20% of the kids with ALL were cured of their disease. And that was the result of people like Dr. Pinkle and Dr. Holland. And now it's probably close to 90 or 95% of the kids. Things have changed. And they've changed because individuals have had guts enough to try to make progress, even in the face of criticism from some of our colleagues. Mm-hmm. So you get your satisfaction, but it's tough. And you die along with some of the patients sometimes. And you just have to figure out how you're going to balance this. Jimmy Holland looked at the attitudes of physicians, and there have been a number of studies looking at this. And there is burnout, sure. No question about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can think of one thing Dr. Pinkle told me when I was doing Cancer Crossings, and this whole question came up, and Mary told me, if you saw somebody drowning in a river, once you try to save them, you jump in, even if you weren't that great a swimmer. And, that kind of typified, this class of medical care. We're getting some questions from the audience. I want to kind of zip through some of these. This one for you, Mary. How did Mrs. Pinkle handle the move from Buffalo to Memphis? Okay, we've had the kids.
Is this one of my siblings asking this?
Maybe, I don't know. But go ahead.
My mom was always up for an adventure. And when my parents were married, they lived, they were in the Army base in Boston, Buffalo again, Memphis, Milwaukee, LA. She just knew how to adjust and make the best of things and was really cheerful. One thing that she did at St. Jude's, which I didn't realize till 10 years ago when I started writing this book, talking to some of the women who were married to St. Jude doctors who were part of the total therapy team that my dad had going, said they would have bolted if it hadn't been for my mom, because she was so warm and supportive. And my dad had this particular woman, her husband had trained in New York at, I think they called it the Babies Hospital. It was part of Columbia. They were very aristocratic Virginians. They show up in Memphis. They're associated with St. Jude, which is kind of liberal, and you know, she's in the gas station with the St. Jude sticker, and the people are like, why are you associated with this place? But anyway, you know, so there was this kind of edginess to being with St. Jude. But the point was, my mom was just apparently just literally put her arms around these other women and said, it's going to be okay. Memphis is okay. Just, you know, you can handle this. And so I had no idea, but a lot of those doctors, their wives would have bolted if it hadn't been for my mom, I guess. Because it was a tough place if you were from, you know, Brazil or Argentina or Boston or New York at the time, because it was so different.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, there's also a little bit of snobbery involved with people, particularly from the Northeast corridor, from DC to Boston, and Boston is the Mecca. When I was at the University of Vermont, I said, Irv Krakoff, who I was working with, we used to say, we ought to change our name to Oxford or Cambridge so that we could be treated a little differently than just as a bunch of yokels from Vermont.
Jerry, we got a question, I think, right up your alley from the audience. And again, I think this is important to kind of put it in some context, and thank you for this. But it's how rare is it to have a major breakthrough in the treatment of cancer, like the one concerning pediatrics at Roswell Park? I mean, how rarefied air are we talking about here?
Well, if you look at the history, I mean, basically there's a number of things that converged. The ability to support the patients, antibiotics were coming into being. I don't know, aureomycin was 1947, penicillin was here before that. And then I did studies with carbenicillin and gentamicin, which took care of a bug called Pseudomonas, which was a major cause of death in some of the leukemic patients. So you've got that happening in the late 50s, in the 50s. You also have the development of new chemotherapeutic agents. And so the time was right for people to take these things and put them together. So is there going to be a magic breakthrough? Well, you know, there have been a few in the past, a treatment of a very rare cancer called choriocarcinoma, and some of the immunological approaches that are occurring now with the lymphomas, where they're using the knowledge of immunology to actually attack the cancer cell. When in the past I used to say it was the weed killer approach with treating leukemia. What we would do is try to wipe out all of the bad cells, all of the weeds, and then hope that the new grass would grow back, would be okay. I think that the targeted approaches, targeted therapy, using monoclonal antibodies to carry chemotherapy directly to specific cancer cells, will change the management of some of these diseases. I would like to be alive for one day, 100 years from now, and come back and look at what we're doing. And I'm sure that they'd be standing around, they'll say, do you know what those dummies did 100 years ago? Because that's where we're at now. The information will explode, and there will be some magic bullets for some of these bad cancers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I used to have a book in my library that kind of cited medical miracles of the last century, 20th century, and pretty much what happened at Roswell Park at St. Jude was right there. It was one of those listed, you know, against such strong odds. Mary, I want to start with you with this one, and Jerry, chime in. We've got a question about palliative care and to what extent maybe it's being now adopted in pediatric oncology. In a sense, palliative care, you know, increased attention to, you know, that's going on in adult medicine. You know, how does that maybe compare with, you know, in the past, et cetera? So, Mary, if you want, because I know your dad was very much involved with the patients, you know, he really took things to heart. but in a sense, kind of here's the tug and war. It's between palliative care somewhat and fighting everything against all odds. And is there a middle ground? Is there a line? And I would imagine it's probably changed over the decades.
Well, I don't feel qualified to answer this because I'm a lawyer, not a doctor. But I can't say that when I've interviewed him, he talked about how you have to figure out, like, it's kind of a risk. Obviously, this is a risky business with children, and you want to give them, you don't want them just to survive. You want them to have a good quality of life. And so it's figuring out how this is all going to work. And I guess this is a little off the subject, but I did ask him one time, what's your the most significant achievement in your career? And he said, it's seeing my patients grow up and lead normal, productive lives. And he talked about one patient in particular who's now a doctor. And my dad treated him when he was 2 at MD Anderson. And this young man's now a doctor. And I was visiting him once about 10 years ago, and another former patient was calling him up for law school references. And I thought, now, how is he qualified to say whether you'll be a good lawyer? But obviously, she thought he could give her a good reference. But I thought, well, how amazing. This was he treated her as a baby in Houston, and now she wants to go to law school in Boston, of all places, which he was very happy to write her a reference. But I think just figuring out how can I help this child live, and just looking at the course of his career, he started out as a young medical student. We're going to send these children home to die. That's all we can do. Okay, now here we are. Oh, my patient's a doctor. I mean, what could make my dad happier than to have some patients become doctors, because only one of his own children became one. So it's like, let's get all the patients to become doctors. So I don't know, it's just a delicate balance, I guess, and trying to figure all this stuff out. Is very complex work.
Very good. I knew your lawyer skills had come through on that one. Jerry, it looks like we've got somebody who may have lost some money on some Bills games or something. Anyway, here's the question. What is the most exciting advance you anticipate in pediatric oncology in the next 10 to 20 years? Where would I put $10 million down on right now? It sounds like he's dead after that Chiefs game, maybe. But project out a little bit there. Where?
I'm not a pediatric oncologist, but my guess is that as we have a better understanding of immunology and how some of the rejection of the tumor, how that might be possible down the road, that's where I would go. I think the ability to identify people or children who are at risk of developing cancer. It's a fine balance when you start looking at bad diseases, if you can predict who's going to get it and who isn't, and the privacy issue. There's a disease, a bad neurological disease called Huntington's chorea that is a fatal disease that has a marker that one can look at and predict whether or not somebody is ultimately going to get the disease. And there are people who elect not to know whether or not they're going to get the disease. So, there's some serious ethical questions as the science moves forward about what's appropriate and what isn't. So can I go back to the palliative care thing about adults? Because I'm not a pediatrician. When we were in Vermont, we did a big study looking at patients with advanced cancer. And one of the things we did was we had nurse practitioners go out to the homes and follow these patients. But we also had a multidisciplinary team, including clergy, PT, OT, social workers, and one of the most interesting things and these are people who were destined to die of their disease. One of the most important things that we did was having the physical therapist go out to the home and look at the barriers for independence because the most important thing you can do with at least with the group of adults was to help them maintain their independence, because the toughest thing is to see patients lose their dignity because of the progression of disease and the inability to function normally.
Good, thank you. We're gonna start wrapping up. I've got maybe one more for both of you guys. Jerry, this is a question that just came in, and I'm intrigued by it, so I'm gonna throw it your way. I may chime in too, but where would we be, in a sense, in the world of cancer research or whatever, without Roswell Park?
Well, this is the 50th anniversary of the National Cancer Act. And the National Cancer Act, Jim Holland participated in promoting this. Jerry Murphy, who was then the director of the Institute, was on the committee that did this. Funding was important. Roswell Park, up until I think the late 70s, never charged anybody. The state of New York paid for all of the care. And so we drew patients from all over the northeast part of the United States. I was at Roswell from 68 to 74. And so it was important because we saw a lot of patients with diseases that we could do something about. But at the same time, we also got a lot of patients who the only thing you could do is provide palliative care. So the state of New York then decided that they could reduce the budget by charging the insurance companies and doing that. Where would we be if there wasn't Roswell Park? Well, the MD Anderson Hospital didn't come into being till the 60s because of the support from the state of Texas. The energy riches were shared, and that started. Danny Thomas and Dr. Pinkle was able to use that relationship, and he was a pioneer in showing that you could in fact do fundraising and support these kinds of activities and not charge the patients. And I think that other places would emerge. When Roswell Park started the Institute because he thought that there were probably viral-like particles that were causing cancer, and talked to the people in Albany, and they started Roswell Park with a $25,000 donation. And obviously that's minuscule now, but it was a start. And so it takes somebody who has an idea, who is going to go ahead and make a presentation and get adequate support to bring the idea to the fore.
Good, thank you. Mary, I think we're going to kind of leave with you, and I want to follow up a little bit on a conversation you and I were having earlier in the week and preparing for tonight. And we were talking about the new hospital complex in Buffalo, in a sense, the new Roswell Park building, UB Children's, et cetera. And I was telling you about the expansive lobby. I love it there. I can remember the old Roswell Park as you do, where, my brother was, and my brother was only supposed to live a year. Thanks to the great doctors and the care he got at Roswell Park, he lived for 8, which we've always considered a great gift in my family. But the new building, I just find stunning. You walk into it, expansive lobby, playing music. Somebody's usually on the piano, maybe somebody's playing the guitar. Music goes well into the night. Such a welcoming place. And you told me your father would have loved such a setting and approach. Why is that?
Well, I think he had the idea that even though, children were really sick, I'm speaking from his view as a pediatrician, that there's so much you can do to help them and to help their families. And I think what appealed to him when he came to Roswell Park in 1956 was that he was going to be able to make this wonderful environment using a team approach with the nurses, physical therapists, psychologists, making this not just, oh, you're in the hospital, you're sick, but let's all be part of the team and make this something that's a nurturing environment. And I think that's what he did at St. Jude as well. It became very nurturing and very pro-patient, very pro-family. And he would have just loved what's happened to Roswell Park today, because it seems like it's making it a pleasure to come to the hospital, as opposed to, oh, I might die and they're just going to send me home to die. It's like, oh, we can have fun here. You know, we'll get better here. So I think he would have just loved it.
Very good. Thank you. With that, I think we're going to wrap up. We a couple more, maybe if questions come in later, email me, we can maybe get some answers to you or whatever. But I appreciate, first of all, Mary Pinkle, Dr. Yates tonight for their time and thoughtful answers. And I think, again, taking us back to a remarkable period of, you know, not just medical history and medical advancement, but also the city of Buffalo. This is what, you know, Buffalo at its best is. And I'd like to thank Buffalo History Museum. I'd like to thank Matt Holland for his help and putting up the photos and such. And everyone, have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.